If you're a criminal, you'll be deported. If you plan to enter the U.S. illegally, your chances of getting caught and sent back just went up. The actions I'm taking are not only lawful, they're the kinds of actions taken by every single Republican president and every single Democratic president for the past half century.
Yeah, so take that, everybody. If there's one thing we know about laws, is that they're always correct. And that was, of course, if you're just listening to the audio platform, you may have recognized the voice of former President Barack Obama during a press conference on November 20th, 2014. ICE funding increased 24% under the Obama administration and reached historically high levels under Biden. In fiscal year 2024, Congress appropriated more than $9.1 billion to ICE. Democrats did not abolish ICE. They expanded ICE's funding. Yet another example of how Democrats don't actually fight against Republicans. They collude with Republicans to serve the rich, the war machine, and the fascist police state. That's just my personal opinion on the overarching theme here. And as is further evinced, by their lockstep policies over the horrors being perpetrated in Palestine, it's all part of the same imperial system. And if we accept the premise that fascism is imperialism turned inward, i.e. the same forms of violence and repression, surveillance and exploitation used in the colonies rebound through imperial feedback to the citizens of the imperial core. And it's crazy, I'm right here in DC, and you may hear sirens blaring down the street. It's been happening more and more recently. So tonight on State of Play on MintPress News, also posting this on my own personal Colonial Outcasts podcast platform to expand the exposure, because of course we're all so shadow banned these days. We're having a two-part ICE episode. Part one, which you're currently watching, is what is happening on the ground, how ICE operates, how local and federal police and now the military are protecting them, what citizens are doing to counter ICE actions, and how this will most likely play out. Part two, we are going to be connecting foreign policy to domestic policy through the lens of both ICE and Palestine, because the connection could not be more direct, and people need to start tying this whole apparatus together, mobilize around issues, and the momentum peters out, and the state is able to solidify its control even more in the name of reasserting law and order. So instead, we want to mobilize against entire international systems. Well, because that's something truly revolutionary. But anyways, let's get into it for part one of yet an unnamed episode. Hopefully I can come up with something very clickbaity, so you just had to, watch it. And hopefully we're here. We're just glad you're here. So today, we are joined by, was that correct? Otherwise, I can go back and edit it.
Costanza Eliana Chinea.
I'm so sorry, guys. I was just in Ireland. I forgot all the Spanish. I mean, I'm a bad Texan. Okay.
All right.
Oh my God, that's bad. A journalist, producer, and activist. For the past year, she's covered the pro-Palestine protests across LA and the student encampments at UCLA and USC. She has contributed to the LA Times, Spotify, Young Turks, Latino Rebels, the LA Public Press, among others. And in 2024, she created Malcria Media, an independent media platform focusing on social justice, politics, and decolonial praxis. Centering marginalized perspectives, she hosts the Political Bendejadas podcast, covering the political and social justice topics with influential guests. And I actually know that one because I know just enough Spanish to know when people are talking shit to me. She has completed a disinformation fellowship through DDIA's, the Digital Democracy Institute of Americas, and she is currently a politics reporter through UC Berkeley Journalism's California Local News Fellowship Program. Thanks so much for coming on.
Thank you for having me. That was a mouthful. Great job.
Yeah, I just did pretty much verbatim with some pronunciation problems, whatever your producer sent me. So there we go. Again, really glad you were able to take the time. You were just spent all weekend covering these protests. There's an entire spectrum of what they're being called.
Yes.
The most tame one is protests. The worst one is Islamo-fascist riots from the Laura Loomers, who are, of course, trying to tie this into the Palestine movement, which of course it is.
Right.
So I guess it's been a bit of a hectic weekend, to put it mildly. And before we get into the details, what do you think is the most important takeaway from the action still unfolding from this past weekend?
Yeah, I think the most important takeaway is that when political figures who present themselves as the opposition don't do enough for the people fight back, the people stand up, the people take to the streets. And I think for people who are very comfortable with the status quo, this might feel very much like a riot. This might look very violent to them. But for the people that the status quo does not benefit, taking to the streets is the most powerful form of people power that you can use. And so I think that's what this moment represents right now.
Right. And of course we can get into like all the the decolonial theory around that, which, you definitely specialize in. But let's just take some reporting from Newsmax, what one of my buddies calls Fox News for people who can't really read so good. Here we go.
Protesters are going to cost somebody their life.
Again, of course, controlled protesters.
If this kind of stuff continues.
Mark, you're absolutely right. And it's not just rocks. It's been bricks as well and other objects, lethal objects that have the potential to kill or.
Okay, so you are hearing the voice of Tricia McLaughlin, DHS Assistant Secretary for Public Affairs. Again, since most of you guys are audio, she basically looks just out of college, which is surprising.
Really hurt one of our law enforcement officers. But I want to say, Mark, this is the natural consequence of when our politicians are calling ICE agents Nazis and liking them to the Gestapo and really encouraging people to demonize and villainize them. This is the natural progression of this. So what do these leftists and these radical politicians expect? They are giving these violent activists a free pass to go after law enforcement. It needs to stop now. It is their responsibility to turn the temperature down, to stop this rioting and stop this looting. And by the way, Mark, I thank you for using the word rioting because that's exactly what's going on. It's not the peaceful protesting that the mainstream media is trying to shove down the throats of Americans.
All right. Well, we're going to talk about the red herring of peaceful protesting. It doesn't mean peace doesn't mean justice at all. But one of the most interesting things is they're weaponizing the use of these rocks. It's exactly what Israeli propagandists do to detain children and stuff. But exactly. I'm just gonna point out all the parallels that I see because these two movements, if we want intersectionality, they've been very separate up until now. So I guess how we could begin is this has been building for 4 days. I just got back into the country and I've been drinking out of a fire hose when it came to this developing story. So do you mind for the audience kind of brief macro timeline of why this happened now? And of course it's been building for years. Yes. But what was the flashpoint?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as a reporter, I pretty much predicted that this was going to happen right after the election. I was one of the few independent reporters that was willing to talk about the failed campaign of Kamala Harris and how it was not looking good for her in the polls. It wasn't that much better than Biden. It was a little better, but not that much better, not enough to win. And so way back in November, I actually started to think about how am I going to tell the story of police activity and ICE activity that's going to increase once Trump takes office. So back in January, I actually published through the San Diego Voice and Viewpoint newspaper a video that you can find on YouTube about how migrants were already preparing for things like this to happen, for escalated ICE raids to happen. And through that, I realized that not enough people were going to be prepared for when Trump actually took office, and not just took office, started writing executive orders around this and emboldening police and ICE to work together, which in California they are not supposed to do because we are both a sanctuary state and also Los Angeles is a sanctuary city. So they attempted right before Trump took office to add in a protectional measure for just the city itself and not just the state. But that doesn't matter to a lot of these law enforcement who will work with ICE even if they could lose their jobs over it, which they won't because they're all protected. And so, that was 4 months ago, and jump to now. I actually couldn't cover the protests over the weekend. I started covering them yesterday and will continue throughout the week. The National Guard is expected to be in Los Angeles for the next 30 days. So I by no means expect these protests to stop just because of one day of protesting. That's not how Los Angeles works. If you've ever been here, the people here are incredibly active. They are incredibly committed and very passionate about this because it affects so many people. This affects people's lives. This affects children, families, teachers, lawyers. Like, everyone is affected by this in one way or another. And so you'll be hard pressed to stop seeing news about this. But essentially, the reason that the escalation started is because LAPD began to, show up in these peaceful protests that actually were peaceful. They were just demonstrations. They started off very small across different cities, but once the ICE raids started to leak online, people started showing up en masse. Now, LA is very, very spread out. So, sometimes it can take you 2 hours to get across town, even though it's all within the LA jurisdiction. And so it's predicted that the reason so many raids were happening at the same time is because LA is so spread out. I think ICE was trying to create a little bit of, deflection and like kind of chaos where people didn't really know if they were going to show up to one or to multiple. And so the community actually started banding together. So what started off as small demonstrations ended up growing bigger and bigger because just the community was coming out and witnessing these raids with ICE agents not identifying themselves properly, taking people out from schools, taking people out from work, from restaurants, and having their faces covered and not showing documentation of even who they were. It was just too much for the community to let slide. And so this has been prepping for many, many months. And the reason that you saw the escalation, especially yesterday where I was at, was because the National Guard was called in overnight. And so people were throughout the night and all of yesterday showing up to the detention center to protest this. So, in terms of that clip that you showed, I think it's very convenient for them to show one clip of, a protester or a few protesters throwing rocks at vehicles that by no means represents the entirety of the protesters and the entirety of the situation. But it also shows the ignorance of victimizing the oppressor, the victimizing the people who are inciting this violence to begin with, right? Mm-hmm. Why don't you show the clips before this happened, before the rocks started flying? And why aren't you being honest about the fact that the people in those cars are armed? The people in those cars have protection. The people outside of the cars do not. All they have is a rock. And I think, your distinction and, you being able to put the puzzle pieces together of how this relates back to Palestine and what's happening in the West Bank, what's happening in Gaza, I think is really important because it's the oppressor victimizing itself and saying, look what they're doing to us without showing the proper context of how this whole thing started.
Right. I mean, the same people who are saying these riots broke out spontaneously or that they're Soros funded or that these guys are controlled opposition, perhaps intimating like some connection to China or like Iran, are the same people who you just say it started on October 7th. Anyway,
exactly.
So we know that their propaganda and their messaging. But I think what's interesting here and is kind of scaring and mobilizing so many people is like the complete double standard between how citizens have to be held accountable for being good, peaceful citizens and what ICE is able to do. And I think what's interesting about that, not just because the historical parallels between having like masked paramilitary forces and masks, like dragging people out of, civic life into who knows where, it's all typified by the mask. And this is, this was Kristi Noem, the head honcho of what's going on essentially right now, talking to the press about it.
Said masks will not be allowed to be worn at protests. Who's going to enforce that and how? And how can you justify it when law enforcement officials have their faces covered?
You know, what I would say is that the law is going to be enforced, and that what the laws are in this country is what we are doing, and our ICE officers and our law enforcement officers out there that are in these situations where people have questioned why they have their faces covered. It's for the safety of those individuals or the work that they're doing as far as protecting their identity so they can continue to do investigative work. So,
but are you tasking the National Guard soldiers with removing masks from protesters? I mean, are you trying to use them in that way?
National Guard soldiers are there to provide security for operations and to make sure that we have peaceful protests. So that's what their work is. And I won't get more specific on that just because we never do when it comes to law enforcement operations. We're doing the same standard procedures we always do and have for years in this country with our National Guard and with our, law enforcement folks that are on the ground working with these communities.
Yep. Not concerning at all. There are a couple of instances where I don't think we have the legal architecture to handle what's going on. It's that, the federalizing of the National Guard, which I think we're going to focus more on part 2 with Butch Ware, who's a gubernatorial candidate. And obviously there's an ongoing drama between Gavin Newsom saying you can come arrest me, Tom Homan, the borders are, and then Trump on the White House lawn today saying ICE can arrest a governor. Why not? So get more into that later. But obviously, this is unprecedented in terms of American history, just like his military parade that we're having on June 14th here in Washington, D.C. I guess another point of concern, and I think what has so many people mobilized, it's kind of like this impunity that's kind of been normalized, not just over decades of ICE existing within the United States and kind of this murky entity that not even a lot of people knew about a few years ago. But now it's front and center as this kind of brown shirt-esque organization. And one of the concerning things is they're able to, and of course some of that impunity has been empowered and normalized by what Israel's doing in the West Bank. I'm sure a lot of those tactics were used by them. They also don't have to provide warrants or charge anybody at all. But ICE is able to I live in Texas. This has been an issue of concern because we're also a border state. The deputization of these white nationalist militias, they can be deputized into immigration officers, essentially, unless I'm misunderstanding it correctly. And that in combination with, the highest selling items online are ICE patches, the ICE kit, which you can buy a facsimile. You can even look at ICE agents to see where their standard operating procedure is to put certain pouches where they have their radio. So how do you tell the difference? Because I live in a castle law state, and if a masked man comes up with guns without a warrant, doesn't identify himself, you should be able to defend yourself. So what exactly is going on here? It's absolutely insane.
Yeah, I think there's just so much to talk about, right? There's so much to talk about how much of a police state we have become, and that's on a federal level, not just as California. And I think a lot of people have a misconception that California is just straight up blue everywhere, very progressive, very liberal. This last election kind of put that on its head and showed that much of the state is turning red, and there's a lot of reasons for that. There are a lot of Latinos here. Latinos tend to lean more conservatively than most, but when they come to this country or they're raised in this country, because they experience xenophobia and racism, a lot of the times they vote progressively, but that is by no means standard across the board. And California used to be a red state. And so we're seeing a shifting in voting politics, but also just in the way in which both the LAPD specifically in Los Angeles, but the police in general are being weaponized against civilians has been on the rise for a long time. We've been talking a lot in Los Angeles about the budget. The state in general is in a deficit. The city is in a lot of debt and also in a deficit. But but the police budget continues to go up and up and up every year, despite the fact that people are fighting to get housing, are fighting to fund affordable housing, are fighting to keep Medicaid funded as well. And so there's just a lot to talk about when it comes to becoming a police state and the slow rise of that. When it comes to these protests as well, it's very important to understand that this is a tipping point for a lot of people. I think people have also a misunderstanding that this is only because of Trump. This isn't only because of Trump. People have been talking about this since Obama had his immigration policies and how Latinos in particular, but all migrants were very upset about that. People have been going to detention centers, politically organizing around detention centers and ICE detention for many, many, many years. ICE has not been around for hundreds of years. It is a relatively new agency.
2003.
Exactly. And much like police as an institution, it was created in order to keep the oppressed and racialized groups and ethnic groups under control. It was never created for anyone outside of our group. And so when you hear, conservatives or even, the Trump administration claiming that they're just going after criminals, they're never talking about European criminal migrants, right?
No.
They're not addressing, the thousands or millions of migrants that cross illegally from, by plane from Europe and other northern nations. They're not talking about those types of migrants. They're specifically talking about Latino migrants, Black migrants, brown migrants, Indigenous migrants. And so we just have to be in understanding that this is a tipping point. This is not the beginning of anything. This is just people are tired. And when they're tired, when they're exhausted, and when political figures who claim to be progressive aren't doing enough for them, they take to the streets. And that's what this is.
Right. And I guess one of the big concerns is like all of these Democratic politicians who are supposed, of course, I think most of our audience would disagree with the assertion that the Democratic Party serves as a counterweight to the Republican Party in any substantial way. You guys can talk about that in the comments section, I guess. But they haven't called for the abolition of ICE. They just want it to be done more politely, it seems.
Right. Yeah. And that's, lots of our revolutionary figures talked about this all the time, right? The biggest setback to any political or civil movement or social justice related movement is the centrist, is the person that sits in the middle and is comfortable with the status quo. Even if they have some objections to what's happening, they're comfortable enough to not protest against it and essentially just want to remain in a comfortable space. And that has a lot to do with capitalism, right? Because they benefit from it. Most of our society is middle class, and a lot of the middle class tends to lean more centrist, especially if they vote democratically. And so this is by no means something that can and should be ignored anymore, but it's something that has been boiling over since the Obama administration, since Kamala Harris went to, the southern border and said, don't come, if you want to cross the border, don't come. You are not welcome here. That angered a lot of people. We have not forgotten about that. People didn't forget about that in the election either. And so even though this is the Trump administration that is escalating this behavior, people have been protesting this for a very long time.
Right. And I read an article like a couple days ago, and you can correct me if I'm wrong on this. This is not my area of expertise, this immigration issue. But they were saying that, under like the Obama and Biden administration, there was actually more deportations. The difference is like the targets that they're choosing for these raids, kind of pushed by like Stephen Miller, this Heritage Foundation ideologue who is responsible for a lot of the Trump administration's messaging, is basically saying, why are you going after criminals? Leaked audio just came out. He said, like, go to Home Depot parking lots. And they're choosing like the most incendiary figures to detain, like MS-13 gang members to El Salvador who aren't MS-13, children accidentally detained. So yeah, I guess what do you make of that? Do you think it's like they're intentionally doing it like this?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, they wouldn't, Trump would not be able to enact a lot of this behavior, a lot of these policies, if the foundation hadn't already been set for him. And I think
Right.
that's really, really important. The previous administration actually paved the way for this to happen, to make it a lot easier for this to happen. And yeah, it's very important to notice that the distinction is when the Democrats or progressives, do deportations, for instance, or have a very strict immigration policy, they do it under the guise of we're only doing this, to help ensure that it doesn't escalate or it doesn't get out of hand, right? We still care about migrants. They have all the fluffy language, right? They use all the right language in order to get you to, kind of overlook this. The main difference here, though, is the lack of due process and is the way in which ICE is conducting these raids now. They are enacting behavior that does very much seem like Nazi Germany, right? They are going into people's homes, going into restaurants, and they aren't showing the proper papers in order to show that person that this is a legal arrest, this is a legal detention. So no, there's no due process when it comes to this. You can't just go into a Home Depot, show absolutely no paperwork, and steal somebody from their job. And that's essentially what this is. And so that's what mostly concerns the population. And the other thing that is very egregious about this is that the language around whether somebody is a criminal or illegal, for example, many of the people that have gone under detention or have been taken attempted to do this properly, right? They were going to their court hearings and were arrested during their court hearings illegally. And so this is the main difference, right? Even though the road towards hell was already paved, right? It's the way in which they are continuing this process that is the most egregious, that should bother everyone, whether you agree with deportations or not. Everyone should be upset at the fact that these aren't criminals. These are people who are attempting to become citizens and are being taken away.
Right. And just from someone with a military background, I just wonder how intentional it is to target children or people who are like going to their immigration meetings, right? Because they obviously have that within their database, and it's like, oh, they're there on this date. We know their home address. We can just send a few ICE officers to get them, and they're not going after criminals. Is it just like incompetence, or is like they're trying to just make it so unwelcome and so impossible that everybody just leaves? Because we have this like whole self-deport narrative.
Yeah. And the self-deportation is a conversation that needs to be had, because there are a lot of people that are scared and have either gone back to their countries or are in a totally different country attempting citizenship elsewhere. So that is a very real thing that is happening. People are very, very scared. But I think it shows also the hypocrisy of conservatives or MAGA or the Trump administration to say, we only want legal aliens here or legal migrants here. Well, you've already made it so expensive to become a citizen. You've already made it so incredibly long of a process. The United States has one of the longest and most complex citizenship processes in the world.
Yeah.
And on top of that, you are targeting them as they are attempting to go to court and see their lawyers and go to their migratory meetings. And so what you actually want is you just want to show force and show that you are controlling this to your own base. That's all that you're doing. You want to show that you are doing this because you can, not because you actually are attempting to create a system in which people do belong and it is inclusive and it is accessible to become a legal citizen. That shows the hypocrisy right there.
I mean, there's also one other point. Like the 50-odd South African farmers that were just like flown in, the government expense. Like that was the most egregious thing that kind of debunks the entire argument, right? And there are people in the MAGA base who are really pissed off about people here on work visas, the H-1B visas, et cetera, et cetera. But I don't know, just looking at, admittedly Twitter is a completely problematic platform, but I don't see a lot of dissent coming from there. And I guess some of the hypocrisy, and just to highlight this for the audience, some of these immigration officials, I'm going to play one more clip from the acting head of ICE from yesterday.
What is dangerous?
This is Todd Lyons at a press conference yesterday.
About a high school junior. He was about to play in the graduation ceremony, play in the band the next day. I guess, what is the danger of the 18-year-old to that community?
So I'll put it back on you. What about an 18-year-old who's just stopped for a traffic violation by Mass State Police, who's wanted to be a habitual traffic offender on his way to graduation? Would you be asking that same question to the Mass State Police for not arresting him? Like, I didn't say he was dangerous. I said he's in this country illegally, and we're not going to walk away from anybody.
So where is he? Is he having due process? Does he have a lawyer?
Yeah, well, the whole due process thing, ICE doesn't just scoop people off the street and remove them. Everyone gets due process, and that is what the U.S. Attorney's Office for. It's what the immigration courts are for.
Interesting. Just have to point out for, just baseline integrity that a lot of their actual messaging coming out of the Department of Homeland Security is, illegal, as they call illegals or illegal criminals don't get due process.
They all do that. He will go in front of an immigration judge. He'll have the opportunity to post bond. But again, I'm just going to ask you a question. Boston police stopped an 18-year-old on the way to high school. Are we having this conversation right now?
Well, there would be a crime. There would be some evidence that we would see.
It happens
something.
every day. Every day. There are multiple 18-year-olds arrested. But yet, we are focused on this one. And I will say, his dad hasn't turned himself in yet, and his dad knows he's the target of it.
Just gonna let that last line sink in. Is he saying he wrapped up the son because they're trying to get to the father? Look, I'd say that was a straw man argument, but that'd be an insult to straw man arguments that are better than that. So and I guess now that we've kind of established that, like it sets a dangerous precedent because I think it was why am I blanking on his name? He's the Speaker of the House. The guy that has the Covenant Eyes dating app with his son. No, he's the Speaker of the House. Sorry, guys. I'm going to have to pull this up because it says something really telling. It's kind of telegraphing that they're not just going to deploy ICE. Speaker Mike Johnson.
Mike Johnson.
Yes.
Good old Johnson.
Yeah, old Mike Johnson. The lawlessness happening in LA is another reason why we need to pass the one big, beautiful bill immediately, the one with extensive cuts to Medicaid and more funding for the police. It provides essential funding needed to secure our nation's borders. Congress will support the brave ICE.gov agents who are fighting to keep Americans safe against illegal aliens and the radical left. Now, 1930s stuff. It starts with illegal aliens, and then it works its way to socialists, and then it works its way to centrist dissidents who all of a sudden get progressive once they know they're screwed and it's already too late to do anything about it. So my question for the second half of the segment is, like, in LA, do you see more like intersectional solidarity than you have before?
Yeah, I mean, it's always been pretty intersectional here. There's no doubt about that, especially once the Palestinian protests became a lot more powerful than I've seen them become in the last 10 years that I've been attending them. You're seeing, Mexican flags along with the Palestinian flag, the Cuban flag, the Puerto Rican flag. You're seeing a lot of cross-cultural, cross-ethnic solidarity, cross-racial solidarity, because just this city is so multiracial and multi-ethnic as it is. When it comes to these particular protests that have been popping off, I think, most of the attention and most of the people showing up are either from Mexico, Honduras, the southern border. But there's also just a lot of multiracial solidarity. You're seeing a lot of kufiyas out. All of my videos show Palestinian flags alongside Mexican flags, El Salvadorian flags. Like there's just a lot of cross-ethnic solidarity to be had. And that is because people know that this this issue is not a one topic issue. A lot of people kept saying that around Palestine, right? When it came to voting, oh, you're just a one issue voter. They're trying to say the same thing. Oh, you only care about this because you're from Mexico. You only care about this because you're Latino or Latina. And that's not it at all. Oppression anywhere is oppression everywhere, right? And we're not free until all of us are free. So that's what you're seeing in these streets is that cross-racial and cross-ethnic solidarity, where people understand that the way that the LAPD and the National Guard is being weaponized against the people is the same thing that's happening to Palestinians in the West Bank and in Gaza.
Yeah, and when it comes to surveillance and AI algorithms and facial recognition software, where was that tested first? Where were some of these officers trained?
Exactly. A lot of people have made that distinction at the protests themselves, where they are basically calling them out in real time, saying, you look just like the IDF, you're acting just like them. And I think there's been several reports already been made that the LAPD was directly trained by the IDF at one point or another, or had some sort of training with them.
Yeah, I know that the LAPD has had liaison and exchange programs, NYPD obviously, but even like the Atlanta Police Department has their own thing too. Like,
yes,
these cop cities that they're building around the country are actually modeled after counterinsurgency centers that they call like little Gazas in Israel. So
yeah. And, we haven't even gotten into cop cities, right? And that's not just happening in Los Angeles. That's happening in Atlanta. That's happening all over the place. In Texas as well. So yeah, this is not a one topic issue by any means.
Right. But there's still people saying that. Before I ask my next question, based off of one of your Instagram stories that I looked at right before we came on, that you posted about this intersectionality issue. You were in LA, or at least California, during the BLM protests. Do you kind of have the same vibe, or is this different? Is this more or less intersectional? Like, I guess what's the salient difference? Because of course, a lot of people on the right are comparing, like, this is the next BLM, So I was wondering if you could comment on that real quick.
I think in terms of police tactics, this does feel a lot like what they were enacting, the violence, at least, that they were enacting against BLM protesters. Again, BLM was also very cross-racial, multi-ethnic, multicultural solidarity. That also was not a one-topic issue. A lot of people recognize that what the Black community has been experiencing for decades, hundreds of years, even, is by no means just something that they experience, but they experience it very aggressively. And so the solidarity came in swiftly and very quickly. A lot of what you're seeing now in Los Angeles when it comes to, immigration or detention isn't just, a brown topic either, right? Like, where a lot of Haitians and Cubans just had their temporary protected status revoked from them. This is reporting that I had already been doing 4 months ago when I did the story for San Diego Voice and Viewpoint. So, this affects all different racialized groups, from the global South. And the more that we continue to talk about that, the better. But in terms of tactics, I am seeing a slightly more aggressive tone today than I was seeing back in 2020. That's not to say that it wasn't aggressive back then. It was egregious. But there's a slightly different tone, especially because the National Guard is now out. And so LAPD feels like they are much more emboldened to shoot people at point blank range, to push them, to shove them, to trample them with horses, as we've been seeing some reports. And they're weaponizing a lot of this in real time. And a lot of it is because the National Guard is here. So this attempt at, quote unquote, de-escalation with bringing in the National Guard actually had the opposite effect, because not only did it bring out more protesters, but it also has emboldened the LAPD to become even more forceful than they've been before.
And I think the great irony is that when the first modern police force was founded in 1829 as the London Metropolitan Police, is because before then, like, a modern police force hadn't existed. It was basically a constable and watch system. With the exception of like slave patrols in the Caribbean that the modern police were also based out of, also counterinsurgency forces in Ireland, fighting against the Irish Republican Army and any sort of Republican dissidents, and they all merged into the modern police force. But the original logic behind having a modern police force actually wasn't horrible, because it was this intermediary, policing power in between, the constable and watch system, which had no coercive force, and sending in the army, which, when you're doing like union busting, always was bad for press. So just having like a pseudo paramilitary force to take care of it was preferable. But it's interesting now, because like every time you send in the troops, it only gets worse.
And I think we also have to talk about not just the racial thing here. We also have to talk about class, because who exactly are these people, protecting? Because it's definitely not the working class. It's not the middle class even. It's always, anytime, policing escalates, or the military is brought in, or National Guard is brought in to do any sort of, people control, is because they're pissing off the 1%. It's because they're pissing off the capitalists and the corporatists who don't want dissent. And that's what all of this comes back to. That's why there is so much cross solidarity here, because it's not just about migrants. It's also a class issue. Anytime you're weaponizing police against the people who have a right to protest, by the way, all of these people who continue, all of these conservatives and MAGA people who continue to spew about, law and order. Well, they're lawfully protesting. We have a country that has a free press, and yet I was threatened with arrest yesterday as a press. I showed my press pass, and they still threatened to arrest me, even though I was in the area that they asked me to be in, and I was not inciting any sort of violence whatsoever. I was enacting my First Amendment right. And so are these protesters.
I was hearing reports that they were like kettling press gaggles.
Yes. So they kettled us. So initially we were with the crowd, and it was fine. And then they started kettling everybody. So they had the two different tactics of the, just a normal kettle where they surround you, and also the crossbow tactic, which they love to use as well. And so literally within 5 minutes of me showing up, I immediately started noticing the tactic, because I've been to enough of these to know once what the formations are for the cops. And so, they kettled the press away from being able to report on the violence that they were enacting against the protesters and on the front lines, for the most part, because there was thousands of people there. People were not being violent. It was just the front lines who were aggressively being pushed. I saw people getting hit with batons who had they were doing absolutely nothing but expressing their First Amendment right. I saw people getting hit point blank with not just tear gas canisters, but rubber bullets.
No, we saw that video go viral of that Australian reporter who was like, if you look at the video, the guy actually like lines her up in the scope and shoots a journalist with a rubber bullet.
Yes, absolutely. And that happened multiple times. And I had many close calls that weren't just from rocks coming at us, but it was rubber bullets. I have a video where I specifically am on the front lines filming, and a police officer starts to point the rubber bullet, canister or whatever, at me, and I had to move out of the way as quickly as I could, because I didn't want to get hit. And I had my press pass in my hand, because if you wear it around your neck, they say, oh, we couldn't see it. So I had it in my hand the whole time. So he knew I was pressed, but he still aimed at me. That reporter, I had been reporting next to her in the kettle area where we were, and had no idea that she had been hit. There were many reporters that had been hit prior to being in the kettle area. So, this is a tactic that they use in multiple countries, where they try to stop the media from addressing or showing a lot of the violence that the LAPD and the police enact against protesters. They want you out of the way so that they can then start shooting.
Right. And I just wanted to circle back real quick, now that we have 15 minutes left, to talk about, this idea of class. And again, if you understand like the propaganda like coming out of Fox News and like Newsmax, which a clip of which we watched at the intro of this episode, they were very put out by the burning of like 4 Waymos. I at least saw footage where like 4 Waymos, and if you don't live in the States, I know we have a very international audience, and if you're in Europe, whatever happens here, your government's trying to get away with it too. So, you should be watching this story. Because again, it's connected all by the same imperialist surveillance national security system that doesn't just exist in the United States. Our police are probably the most brutal out of all the European countries, although the Germans are trying to give us a run for our money.
They sure are.
Anyways, about the Waymos, they are, it's essentially this self-driving car startup. Were very popular in Silicon Valley with all like the rich tech world uses Waymos. Mm-hmm. And of course, they were very disturbed that 4 Waymos got burnt. And they didn't understand it. They were just like, just hooligans destroying property, because they're poor and they're jealous or whatever. But I think Vina Dubal, she's a professor at UC Irvine. She just put out this tweet. 2 sentences explaining it. People are burning Waymos because they are vile representations of governance that has valued profit over the public good. They represent labor replacement because they're self-driving cars, the decimation of public transport because we have rich people of Waymos. You don't need trains, and wild sci-fi fantasies being privileged over common sense. So that's why the Waymos got burnt. And also, I just did, now that we're talking about class, and I think how like the best way to go forward is to kind of center that. We've been seeing, I follow a lot of people like BIPOC, like liberal accounts that go to the DNC and they follow like they want you to vote for Harris, which okay, cool, but they have this take, and I want to be sensitive around it. And I'm also in the part 2 of this episode going to get Professor Ware's take on it, but I've been following a lot of like Black content creators who are like very outspoken during the BLM protests, now saying essentially like, this isn't our fight, where Black people are resting right now. And you posted this tweet saying from the ghetto activists saying, fuck it, I'll say it. A lot of this isn't our fight posts y'all have been seeing is actually a trauma response to what happened in November. Black folks saw this for what it was, misogynoir. And after the exit polls dropped, many of us said, I bet. I'm not going to police how some Black folks have chosen to react to recent events, but I do know healing needs to happen, and that can't happen until there's been an acknowledgement of what happened back in November. And I guess people are just trying to understand that position.
Yeah.
And your response to it.
Absolutely. Yeah. That was a post by my friend Tony, who I have been longtime friends with since the BLM, protests started, and everybody became woke all of a sudden. And, he talks a lot about anti-Blackness. And, I have never pretended that, during the election, Kamala didn't have, or didn't experience anti-Blackness from many people, right? We all saw the poll results. It was 85% white voters who voted MAGA. And a lot of that has to do with anti-Blackness. A lot of that has to do with racism, across the board. And so I'm never going to pretend that that didn't happen. But we also have to understand that, not all Democrats are actually progressive, and not all Democrats have our best interests in mind. A lot of Democrats are actually corporatists, which leads back to capitalism, which hurts the working class. So I think that he's 100% right that the Black community is allowed to feel however they want to feel about this moment. And a lot of the Black community is in solidarity with this moment. It's a subset of people that are, exhausted and are rightfully, critiquing a lot of the anti-Blackness that they experience from the Latino community, from the global South. That's not a lie. They're not making stuff up when they talk about that. So they're allowed to feel however they want to feel. But what I'm seeing on the ground is that it is very multiracial solidarity, and everybody is in on this fight, especially for Black migrants who are being targeted.
Yeah. And of course, there's a lot of the Latino community in the migrant community that is also Black, Indigenous, or, Hispanic, like, as you mentioned before we talked, like Haiti. And so, Yeah, no, I was just curious about that because, a lot of people have been remarking on it, and I'm not really the one to add my 2 cents on it. But yeah, if you're saying that you're seeing the same kind of intersectional solidarity, that's definitely hopeful, and I do hope that everyone needs to get involved, because like I don't know, when it's too late to stop like banding together and resist, we're screwed. Like we're screwed.
Yeah.
We all know where this is going. It's not going to look like 1930s fascism, because it might not even be as militant, because there's no actual economic system that exists to challenge capitalism. So it's going to look different, but still the end game is going to be very similar to what we've seen throughout history.
Absolutely. Yeah. And when you're a politics reporter like myself, you have to look at the historical record to see, is this a consistent thing that we've seen throughout time? How do these things actually play out? And this is part of the playbook, right? Again, going back to how the people are comparing this to Nazi Germany. Nazi Germany didn't happen overnight. That was a very long process of anti-Semitism, and not just anti-Semitism, by the way. It was specifically white supremacists, which meant everybody who didn't fit that standard was also out.
Yeah, but from a violently anti-socialist perspective.
Exactly. And so we have to understand this moment in time. The Germans who were living in that time, their emotions were weaponized against them in order to get them to sign off on a lot of that behavior. It's not very different from what's happened in this last election. A lot of conservatives or MAGA supporters, their emotions are being weaponized against them to think that migrants are the problem, to think that there's an invasion happening in this country, to think that, racialized people and poor people are, the main culprits and the main problem that we're having in this country, not the capitalists, not the 1% who are taking away people's jobs, not the 1% who are taking away people's profits, right? Not the CEOs who are taking away, their ability to have access to healthcare. Not the, rich politicians who are benefiting from Medicaid being taken away, from affordable housing being taken away, even if they come from a more quote unquote progressive political party. So a lot of this is just a weaponization of what the actual problem is, and a distraction from what the actual problem is, against people who are already hurting, right? Economically, financially, losing jobs, losing opportunities. This is a huge, huge moment in time where we need to sit back and say, who are the real problem people here? And it's definitely not migrants, and it's definitely not racialized people or even poor people.
Right. And I think one of the most demonstrative or at least, a passage that we use to kind of like demonstrate like why, how this rolls its way up the privilege ladder until it targets just enemies of the state or the ruling party is there was this, a lot of you guys are going to know about this. There was like kind of like this confessional prose piece by the German Lutheran pastor Martin Niemöller that he gave in 1946. And it's kind of instructive because Niemöller was detained by the Nazis. He was a Nazi. He was a fascist. He supported everything. And, they eventually arrested him, the Gestapo, because he was outspoken against the Nazi party taking control of the church, and blending it explicitly with the state. And so, of course, he says, at first I came for the communists, but I wasn't a communist. So I didn't speak. And then, socialists, trade unionists, then it was the Jews. And then, by the time they came for me, there was no one left, essentially. And so that's just kind of demonstrative, because like you can be on side until you're not, and then you're cooked, as the kids say. So I guess now for the short term, it's kind of impossible to see how this is going to happen. Do you think the momentum will continue, especially if ICE doubles down? Because it seems like the administration is going to continue to try to exert force until it works. Because I guess every problem for them is a nail, and they just need a bigger hammer. So pass the big, beautiful bill, because we need 18,000 more federal agents. And I just want to say, they know there's not enough of them. That's why that's why everyone like all these Republican politicians are like, we need to get this bill passed. There's
Mm-hmm.
look, if you look at any sort of revolution throughout history, there's never enough cops or troops. But anyways, how do you see the force doubling down, increasing? Do you see this petering out?
Yeah, what I'm hearing from people on the ground is that this is going to continue. This is not, the people are not going to go away, like stay home, essentially. If they plan on keeping the National Guard here for the next 30 days, there's going to be protests for the next 30 days. That's what I'm hearing. So by no means are people backing down. So I think this is a moment in time for the administration to really, take a second look at this and decide, is this the type of money we want to be spending for the next month or, more? And also, I think this administration has shown that this MAGA cult like solidarity doesn't always last very long. I think we saw that with Elon Musk. I think we saw that with a lot of these.
Well, yeah, we also saw that. We called it last summer when everyone started posting scenes from like Mean Girls where they like started like writing in the burn book. We knew that they're going to have like a high school falling out.
Exactly.
Because they're dominated by, but not just ideology, but capital interests, some of which conflict with other billionaires and their ideology as well. But it's also around the Israel issue, because a lot of MAGA people who thought they were putting America first are at the very least wanting to not send any more money to Israel. I mean, they might still hate Arabs, but they don't want this like global transnational one world government, which they kind of see that as endemic of, and they're being called like the woke right. And they're calling the people calling them woke right back, because they're trying to cancel people for their ideas. So I do think there's a lot, and there's also been a lot of ideological fragmentation about this Palantir national database, which ideologues like Steve Bannon have kept talking about, like the Chinese surveillance state and social credit scores. Well, this will actually be a lot more centralized as it looks on paper than whatever they have going on in China too. So hopefully the ideology just falls apart from the inside.
Absolutely. And I think that's my point, is that, when it comes to this issue, they may seem like they're very much on board with a lot of what's happening in Los Angeles right now in terms of deployment, in terms of the military, in terms of National Guard and LAPD tactics. But the moment it starts really sinking into them that, this is also an economic issue, I think a lot of that solidarity of, keep arresting them, keep, going after these people, I think a lot of that is going to start to die down the longer this extends. So I don't think it benefits the administration either way, obviously, from the point of view of the protesters. But from the point of view of even their own base, this doesn't make sense, especially if you're saying it's America first and you want to fix the economy, quote unquote, and you want to do all of these things for the American people. Well, the moment this starts affecting them, which it will very soon, that's not going to fly. So I don't foresee them, we've already seen that Trump is amenable, right? Like he will change his mind if he sees that his own base is going against it. And so that's very possible for this.
Yeah. Or if he realizes he's not going to get what he wants. That's why he was so triggered by the name Taco Trump. Trump always chickens out about the tariffs. Right. I mean, we'll see. I guess, I don't know. This is kind of unprecedented too. I mean, it's been building like this for a long time, but
right.
I don't know. People, this has been the most singular, unsuccessful day and unpopular first 100 days of an administration, I think, since, at least before the 21st century. So.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Well, I guess we'll keep watching this. And just as a side note to my New York homies, all the trash you talk on LA, beating you right now, so
we got this. We got this.
Also, if you're call to action, if you're a veteran in the DC metropolitan area, Trump is doing his Mussolini parade on June 14th. This is this coming Saturday. Veterans for Peace and Veterans About Face are going to be there. They're not, it's going to be pretty mild, but there's other stuff going on, which you can learn about if you come down. So that's June 14th. That's the next one. And we should all be intersectional and kind of build off what's happening in LA with regards to, having an actual dictator military parade for a sitting president, which is the first time it's happening in U.S. history. And it's going to backfire, I think.
Absolutely.
I try to have some sort of revolutionary optimism. But anyways, thank you so much for coming on, Costanza. Your socials and your podcast will be linked in the description. And this has been State of Play on MintPress News. Stay tuned for part 2 with Professor Butch, where we're going to be talking about the Democratic Party of California. So I think you can know where that's going. So again, anyways, thank you so much for your time. And we will see you here in a minute. Cheers, y'all.